Some updates on the ZT0561. As an interesting little experiment, I tried Murray Carter's method of sharpening, where he planes down the flats of the blade to sort of maintain the edge thickness. So what he calls is working both bevels, primary and secondary. And he's very harsh in criticizing a lot of other sharpening methods, including jigs like the Sharp Maker or Wicked Edge, because he says they're designed to only work on the edge bevel, not the primary grind. However, on steels like this, these have an exceptionally low grindability, which means it's very difficult to remove metal from them with an abrasive. And I found using the equivalent of a King 1000 grit Waterstone, 5,000 passes per sides on the flats didn't really do anything except scratch up the finish. It's just, again, essentially far too hard to remove material. In order to actually affect a significant change to the edge thickness, you're talking about many, many more passes per side. So I don't think that style of sharpening or that method is actually effective unless you just use steels like he uses, which are essentially white steel, often cladded, very high grindability, especially on the cladding. In regards to edge retention, after multiple rounds of use, sharpening, the performance has increased dramatically over what it was initially. And by sharpening, I mean actual sharpening, not, honing, stropping, that kind of stuff. After the knife is used down to where it has very little sharpness, as in sort of starting to rip cardboard, that level of sharpness, the edge is then ground off by cutting it straight into a stone, then it's re-apexed and then refined. It's still only around here, VG10 level, in terms of long-term edge retention, which is not very good considering that it's significantly more expensive. But even worse, it's significantly more difficult to grind. So it takes you longer effort to grind the steel off it, but you end up with about VG10 type performance. Again, I don't think this is the steel. There's nothing inherent in the chemistry of the steel or the way that it's made which should predict such low performance. I still think it's mainly that the edge has been seriously overheated, because a number of Elmax blades from ZT have shown it, and a number of users have shown them from other blades as well using Elmax. Gav put up a video where he showed a line steel blade, same exact problem. The unfortunate thing about this from a user point of view is twofold. If you don't know what the problem is, if you don't know how Elmax is supposed to behave, you're just going to end up very frustrated, because you'll find it very difficult to sharpen a blade. It takes a long time to remove metal from it. The burr formation can be very persistent. You can see micro cracking at the edge. Performance in general is very low, and you're just going to get very frustrated. Even if you do suspect what the problem is, you're into a sort of awkward situation where you're sharpening, using it, and never quite being able to tell, okay, do I really have the performance of Elmax now? Do I need to grind off a bit more? Okay, now I think I may have it. Let's grind off a bit more. You're going to end up, even in best case scenario, of grinding off too much metal along the edge before you finally get a bit satisfied. So even in best case scenario, blades like this are going to be frustrating. In regards to utility, I've used it for quite different types of materials, light wires, heavy gauge wires, all kinds of plastics, cardboards, light metals like cans and that kind of stuff, foams, carpets. It does in general relatively well, with a couple of exceptions. Again, the blade is relatively wide, the point is relatively wide, and the stock is relatively heavy. Even though Kylie has done a very nice job in thinning out the primary grind, and I've lowered the edge angle to around 10 degrees per side, more on that a bit later, you're still facing those issues of just a very wide, relatively thick blade with a relatively thick point. So doing the same type of work with Spyderco Paramilitary, again, has a much finer point because of the distal taper, and much finer point because of the actual taper in the width as well. So it's much easier to get in and use the point to do cutting. It's also much lighter, so it's easier to use, just hold and carry in hand. So it's not going to match even the ability of something like the Paramilitary for such work, let alone something like an Opinel, which essentially for its size pretty much defines cutting ability, with relatively thin stock, very high grind, very, very thin and acute edge, and relatively sharp point. So looking at that, you make the argument, okay, well, it's not made purely just for, light utility cutting, obviously. It's for heavy work, and just look at the size of it. The massively wide blade, the massively thick blade, the great big overbuilt handle. What happens if you use it for heavier tasks, such as prying and chopping? Now, I've done some chopping work with it, and it is more capable, again, because of the heft, because of the sheer weight of it. It does have some ergonomic problems and been able to hold it ideally, but there is potential there. For doing woodwork, if I had to do it outside, I'd kind of want to have this over the paramilitary, with one sort of exception, which I'll talk about now. To sort of put out a rough way to gauge prying ability or strength of a knife, I did a little experiment. This is a piece of 1x3 strapping, very easy to get. I used two 2.5 inch galvanized nails. This is 6 inches long, equally spaced this way, equally spaced this way, nailed it into a piece of 6x6. Now you can adjust how difficult it is to pry off by how long the piece of wood is, because the longer the piece of wood, the greater the torque you will have and the easier it will be to pry off. So you can sort of set a sort of benchmark for when a knife fails to be able to do this. Keeping in mind that there's a lot of variation in how nails grip wood, because the actual surface texture of the nails is very important, the angle that they go into the wood, and the grain of the wood and the nature that you're nailing it into, presence of knots and that kind of stuff. So you want to do this a few times before you'd say yes or no on a particular height. But in any case, that's what I think you could develop relatively easy into some sort of rough benchmark that sort of anyone could use to get a quantifiable number. So with that nailed on, I took this 710 San Remu and attempted to pry it off. Very little progress was made, and the blade started to take a bend, and the handle started to get a bit wobbly at roughly about the same time. And I could maybe make, say, 1/8 of an inch of progress trying to pry the piece of strapping off the wood. So this sort of failed. But it failed very consistently. Like I said, the blade took a little bend, and the handle sort of started to open up at the same time. And it was mainly very easy to fix, just retighten up the pivot and sort of work the blade back a little bit, straighten it back out. Consistent design, not enough strength though. The ZT is significantly thicker in cross-section and significantly thicker in width. Combining all of them together, it's about 3 times stronger in the blade than the 710. I did pry off the 1x3. In retrospect, 6 inches is relatively short. Galvanized nails are relatively strong binding. It was not very easy to pry off. So while it did pass and did show significant strength, a couple of immediate downsides. This jimping is really aggressive, and this handle is just really uncomfortable. Of course, when you're prying, you want to get maximum leverage, so you end up sort of gripping around the sort of back of the handle and torquing it. Well, these points, while they may not look it, are very sharp index points. Now, I guess mainly they're there as some kind of striking surface, I guess. But if these were completely rounded off, it's much more comfortable in an overhand grip if you're prying. With these as pointy as they are, this really digs into your hand. And of course, the jimping and the clip and all that stuff doesn't help. The major issue, however, was this lock disengaged immediately as soon as lateral force was put on it. Now, I'm very familiar with liner locks and integral locks in general. I know that they're unstable under a lot of issues, so I was very careful with what I was doing, because I knew the lock was very likely to collapse, and it did. So as soon as I would go to put lateral force, the lock would just release and the blade could then fold. Thinking back to chopping, I was doing mainly light chopping. If you start doing heavier chopping, you are going to start getting lateral loads on the blade, because even though you might not think it, when the blade goes into something, it doesn't go in perfectly straight and smooth. It's all over the place when it's going into it. That will induce lateral loads. So while light chopping it did well, I really would not feel safe and comfortable using this for heavier snap chopping, even though the blade is plenty strong enough, the handle and pivot plenty strong enough, the lock just isn't secure. And it's very likely on a sort of hard snap chop that this can go into something, and when you jerk it back out, because you'll be doing this very fluidly, you won't even be thinking that you're hauling it back out, the lock could collapse and you'll arc the blade right down onto your hand. So curiously, where does that actually leave me in regards to the blade? I have a blade which, I mean, can't come near matching the cutting ability of something like this, which is made just to cut well. This is another version from Mastercraft. Uses, again, disposable carpenter blades, what they call them around here. These blades actually come in high-speed steel. You can actually get them even cut like a saw, hooks, nice utility. But it can't even match something like this, of course, which is the Lum Chinese from Spyderco, or of course the paramilitary. But trying to use it for heavier work, it's unsafe because the lock is unstable. Even though the blade and handle are wonderful grand, the lock isn't. So it's an example of an inconsistent design. Although parts of it obviously can handle a task, other parts can't, so it doesn't matter if they can or cannot, because it simply fails at the weakest point of it. As everyone is very fond of saying and commonly cited, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Well, if you have a chain made of heavy links of iron, and one of them is essentially a link of paper, the iron links don't matter because it simply busts at the paper every time. This lock releases under lateral loads very easy, so dynamic impacts or prying is essentially out in terms of safe use. In regards to comfort, which is the last thing that I'll mention, I did try this with some light cotton gloves. They're very common around here. Fishermen, carpenters, most tradespeople use them. They're only about 50 cents. People pretty much treat them as disposable and rarely wash them. They just throw them out when they get really dirty. The light cotton gloves did handle the jimping relatively well, meaning that they took away the discomfort that normally goes on your hand. And I was able to do full power cuts, which is more than 50 pounds of force, into birch hardwood flooring with no issues in regards to pain and discomfort in the hand. There was some light ones, yes. The inner parts of these scales were left relatively sharp, so I could still feel that a little bit. The other thing, though, was the jimping did a number on the gloves. Even after that much work, I could start to see the fibers separate and some abrasion on the fibers. So using this on light gloves, you're going to have to be careful because you will tear up the glove just like you will tear up your hands. I did actually take this apart and slightly work the inside of the handles relatively easy and just lightly hit the inside edges of the jimping as well with a stone. And even that light breaking of the edges made a significant difference in terms of comfort and feel in hand. I'm going to carry this for quite some time more. Again, I just want to get a feel for how my initial impressions and sort of stock test translates to real life use over a period of a couple of weeks and see what happens. But overall impressions are not very positive, especially when you compare this to other knives in its price range and other knives in its general sort of size, shape, and class. It simply can't match the cutting ability or general utility of a lot of other knives. And all this weight and power and strength of the blade and strength of the lock and these great big heavy standoffs is all non-functional because the blade just releases. Now, as a final note, Kylie Harris, the guy who owned this previously, did some relatively hard work with the blade and did slightly damage the lock face on the inside. So the instability that I'm seeing could be caused by that. But I've seen the exact same instability on locks which were absolutely brand new. And the thing that I don't like about liner locks and integrals in general is the whole security, not the strength, because the strength is very different. The whole security of this lock depends on the exacting geometries of this lock face. And it's really, really non-trivial to do right. And I've seen samples of the exact same knife from the exact same manufacturer be wonderfully secure and other ones be wonderfully insecure. And you don't see that kind of extreme variance on lots of other locks.